obviously you're going to get questions and you want to answer the questions, so it's really helpful to understand what the question is actually asking before you try to answer the question. That's in essence what we're going to be doing. All we're going to try to do here is talk about the three main categories, again, the domestic, economic, and international questions, the types of questions, how the questions are structured, what they're trying to ask, how to answer the question, and how to choose a question. We're going to be going through some examples as we go through all of these, and then we're going to get to a group exercise again at the end, and I'm excited for that. Okay, cool. The three categories. We're not going to give a speech today. We will on Wednesday. Okay, the basics. What are the basics of these three types of questions, these three categories? Again, there are three main categories that all questions will fall under: domestic, international, and economic. I talked about this a little bit earlier, so this should just basically be a refresher. There are three fundamental different types or different categories. Think of these three questions like the genus. It's the highest set of the relationship. It's the highest form. There's going to be other subsets under these, but the three categories, these three main categories, are going to encompass all of the different types of questions. Usually one round will have all questions in one category. Usually a tournament will say, all right, this round we're going to have domestic, this round we're going to have international, this round we're going to have economic. All the questions are going to be along the same category. Sometimes though they'll be mean and mix it up. And your main competitor who loves economics questions will get an economics question, and you'll get a domestic question, and you will be really sad. Sometimes they mix it up, but usually it's going to be contained within one category in one round. Determining your question type helps you develop your argumentation, and here's what I mean by this. If you have an economic question, most of your analysis is going to need to be economic. If you have an international question, most of your analysis is going to be political, how different countries relate to each other, how different countries are going to affect each other, what's going to happen. If you're dealing with domestic, most of your argumentation is going to be contained within the United States. So this helps you to limit down your argumentation to what you actually want to argue. So let's start off by talking about domestic questions. The domestic category covers subject matter that is contained to the United States. If you think about the word domestic, it means contained within one country. So when we're dealing with domestic questions, they're questions that deal with the United States. They deal with U.S. affairs. They deal with U.S. politics, U.S. elections. They deal with what the government is going to do about something. Is the EPA going to do something? Is the DOD going to do something? Is the U.S. military doing something? Etc., etc. Basically, if it is a question where the main subject is the United States, then this is covered. This can be identified easily if the main subject of the question is the United States. So if we're dealing with the United States, or we're dealing with something inside the United States, it's going to be contained to a domestic question. Here's an example of this. Should the Commission on Presidential Debates lower the threshold of support that third-party candidates need to acquire to participate? No, because third-party candidates don't matter. But that is a domestic question because it is contained completely within the United States. This entire question is dealing with the United States, is dealing with what the United States is doing and what the United States is going to accomplish. So these domestic questions are usually going to deal with the United States. However, there is one type of question that is a little bit borderline on this. And if you want to make a note on this in your margins, these are questions that deal with U.S. foreign policy. So there are going to be some questions that deal with U.S. foreign policy. For instance, what is the United States going to do with Russia? Or how will Trump's election affect Russia? Now, why these might seem international because they deal with other countries, they're actually domestic questions because the main subject of them is still the United States. They question about whether or not Donald Trump's election will affect Russia. The main subject of that is still contained to the United States. It's still domestic, so the question itself is domestic. I'll explain this a little bit more as we get into the international questions. International questions usually focus on things that are primarily outside of the United States. So if we're dealing with something outside the United States, we're dealing with other countries, we're dealing with how other countries relate to each other, or what other countries do with themselves, we're usually asking or answering an international question, a question dealing with other countries. Again, don't confuse U.S. foreign policy with international questions. For instance, this is an example of an international question. How will Venezuela's economic difficulties affect Cuba? That has absolutely nothing to do with the United States. So it is very clearly an international question. It's dealing with, well, you could also make an argument that this is economic, but I'll get to that in a second. But basically the main argument is that it's international. It's dealing with other countries relating to each other. And because of that, it deals in the international spectrum. Now a question that would be, yeah, again, covering the difference between U.S. foreign policy and international questions. We covered that just a second ago. Hopefully we'll start to develop this more as we get into some examples. All right, third, economic questions. Economic questions focus more on global economics or the economics of a certain country. So economic questions are going to deal with, guess what, the economy. They're going to deal with money, they're going to deal with banks, they're going to deal with market structure in industry, maybe they might deal with the global market or maybe what the UN is doing with money or something like that, I don't know. But basically the point is it's going to have something to do with economics. These questions are a subset of domestic and international questions. This is really important because economics isn't necessarily its own category in and of itself. It's going to be either domestic economic questions or international economic questions. So economic is a subset of these two different categories. An example of this would be, should minimum wages be determined on a state-by-state basis? Now that is a domestic economic question. It's a question contained within the United States that is dealing with the economy. If we move back to the last slide, this question is an international economic question. It's still an international question. It still deals with Venezuela and Cuba, but it's probably going to be more focused as being an economic question. So if you want to make a note on that. Okay, a quick note before we move into some examples of determining whether or not certain types of questions are a certain type. A quick note. It is entirely possible, it's even probable, that a question will extend past just one category. It's necessary when you have an economic question. An economic question is going to be either domestic or international, so it's going to have more than one category. But it's completely possible that you might have a both domestic and international question. And that might sound a little confusing, but basically what you're going to have to do is just follow the argumentation. These categories exist to limit your argumentation, so if there are multiple categories, that just means you have more arguments. Remember, your arguments, your analysis should be contained to that type. If it is an economic question, you should be dealing with the economics of the issue. You should be analyzing the economics of the issue. But if it's an economics, international, and domestic question, then you get to talk about economics, international things, and domestic things. So you just have more arguments at your disposal. So don't be afraid to say that one thing might have a little bit more to it than just one category. But with that being said, restrict it if it ought to be restricted. If something ought to be restricted, if something should be limited to one specific category, then definitely, then definitely do that. Throwing the remote all over the place. Restrict it if it ought to be restricted. All right, we're going to go over some examples now. If I could get people, I'm going to have a question's going to come up here, and then we're going to talk through what type of question we think it is, what category it is, and then we'll move on. I think I have 4 of those. So could I get somebody to read this question for me?
Would a Donald Trump presidency significantly alter American foreign policy toward Russia?
Okay. What type of question is this?
Domestic.
Yes, very good. Because it's dealing with U.S. foreign policy. Donald Trump is the main subject of it. So a Donald Trump presidency is what we're talking about, so it is contained within the U.S. All right. Mackenzie, do you want to read this one?
Mm-hmm. How can the West ensure that Erdogan does not destroy Turkish democracy?
Okay. What do you guys think? Yeah. You could make an argument that when it talks about the West, it's talking about the U.S. and therefore it's talking about U.S. foreign policy. But the West usually refers to like all of Europe and the U.S. too. So it's probably going to be international. Again, some of these are going to be borderline. It's not going to be like there is only one right answer to this. Most of them are going to have one right answer. But sometimes it's a little more borderline like that. Yeah.
In your speech, should you say to the judges this is more of an economic question or international, or should it be inferred through your evidence?
That should be assumed through what arguments you make.
Okay.
So if you say, what will Venezuela's economic difficulties, what effect will they have on Cuba? And all of your arguments are, look, they're losing jobs, they're losing, their main industries are falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty clear you're making economic arguments, you're making arguments about the economy, and therefore it's probably an economic question.
Alright.
Judges, this trichotomy, in a sense, is more for you than it is for the judge.
Alright.
It's more for your development of your argumentation than it is for the judge to say, oh, check mark, they understood that this is the right type of question. It's more for you. Okay, somebody read example 3.
How can the Canadian government improve commerce across its provinces?
That's like economic and international.
Yes. So it's an international economic question. All right, 4. Somebody want to read?
Will the U.S. economy experience a recession by the end of 2016?
Domestic.
Yes. Okay, so I hope you guys see this is a pretty simple concept. It's pretty simple to grasp some of the differences. What our group exercise is going to be doing is kind of reinforcing, working through a lot of resolutions and dealing with what type, what category of resolution they are. So we're going to get more practice with that.
Wait, resolution?
I'm so sorry. It's really the same difference, but not at the same time. Okay, anyway, let's move on now to the types of questions. Now, you're not going to find these types of questions in some fancy Extemp book. I'm not saying that these are the only types of questions or that these even make sense. I came up with them at 1:30 yesterday morning, or this morning. So these are just, in my experience, how I would split the different questions into different categories. What the general types of questions are. So take this with a grain of salt, think through and develop kind of your own list, but these are kind of the 7 different types. Close-ended action, I'm going to talk about through these, so don't think you have to furiously write notes on these. Close-ended action, open-ended action, established predictive, unestablished predictive, descriptive, degree, and timing. So these are the 7 fundamental types of question. We're going to be going through each of these. So first of all, we're going to deal with questions of action. We're dealing with close-ended and open-ended action. Close-ended action asks if a certain group should take a certain action. So it asks, should X do Y? Should X agency, should X like government agency make this specific policy reform? So in other words, what you're saying is that what you have to answer is that somebody should do something specific. The solution is contained, the action is contained within the question. An example of this would be, should the United States bomb ISIS? The United States is X. The United States is the agency. Bombing ISIS is the action. So the question is, should X take specific close-ended Y action? This is on the opposite side of the spectrum from the open-ended action, which asks what a certain group should do about something. It follows the form, what should X do about Y? So to rephrase that earlier question in this format, what should the United States do about the expansion of ISIS in wherever ISIS is? The Middle East, there we go. So that's something that's more open-ended. That's something where your answer to that question is going to have more justification. You're going to have to explain more about your answer than just answering it yes or no like you would with a close-ended action. Both of these questions force you to propose or defend something outside of the status quo. Both of these ask you, should something be different than the way it is now? Should something fundamentally shift? Should something fundamentally change? In other words, these 2 types of questions are going to be followed with a policy claim. You're making a proposition, you're making a statement of policy that something ought to be different, that an action ought to change from the way it is in the status quo. Yeah.
Would you agree that these 2 questions represent the easiest and the hardest questions to answer in Extemp? Like the easiest one is the close-ended because it's yes or no, and then the open-ended you have to come up with a full policy.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Like a cross-sex question.
Yeah, that's what I thought you said.
Well-
Would you agree?
Generally, I would agree. Sometimes there are other types of questions that are just really poorly worded and they're really hard to deal with. But for the most part, I would say, yeah. If you have a close-ended action question that's asking, should this person do this, that's really contained, it's really narrow, and it's going to be really easy to prove. If you're saying, what should somebody do about this? What should somebody do to solve ISIS? Like, how are you going to spend 7 minutes proving to somebody that you can do something that's going to eliminate ISIS? So I definitely agree that open-ended action questions are probably going to be along the harder lines. There are other open-ended questions that can be asked contained within these, but this is just to illustrate the difference. Okay. The second main type of question, there's 2 types of question under this, are predictive questions. Predictive questions are things that ask us to basically predict the future. that ask us to say what is going to happen in the future, what is going to happen if we do something, or what is going to happen if we continue on our current course of action. Predictive questions will ask questions about what will happen in the future. This is why they are predictive. They are predicting what is going to happen. Now understand that politics is all about predicting the future and then explaining later why it didn't happen. You can thank Winston Churchill for that one. But what you're doing there is you're basically just channeling your inner foreign policy analyst, and you're saying, look, something is going to happen. Something is going to occur in the future. There are two different types of predictive questions, however. Established predictives analyze the effect of something that exists. So what will the effects of X be? There is an assumption that when you have an established predictive that you're analyzing what will happen if something is allowed to continue the way it is. So what will be the effect of Donald Trump's nomination? That is an established predictive. You're trying to predict the future, but you're predicting the future of something that has already happened. You're predicting the future of something that is established. He is the Republican nominee. Predicting the future of something that is established, of something that already exists. This is fundamentally different than an unestablished predictive, which forces you to analyze a hypothetical. Basically, the form of this question is, what would X do about Y? Or what effects would X have on Y if X were passed? So in essence, if I had a question like this at Night Talk, I forget what it was. Basically, if Turkey's prime minister changes, what will the effect be on their rule of law? That's in essence saying, if something happens, hypothetically, let's assume that this is going to happen, what are the effects of that going to be? Unestablished predictives can be really hard because oftentimes there's not a lot of information at your disposal because it hasn't happened yet. You cannot look at the facts, you can't look at the empirics because there are none. It hasn't happened, it hasn't occurred. You have to predict the future, you have to predict the hypothetical, and be willing to make a judgment about that. Okay, so this is kind of the fifth type of question. There were two contained within each of those, but this would be descriptive questions. This is, in my opinion, probably the easiest question. Actually, definitely the easiest question. Definitely, that makes sense. Definitely the easiest question I think that you can get in Extemp. Descriptive questions ask about whether or not something has happened in the past. In other words, has X done Y? Has X thing accomplished or achieved Y? Most descriptive questions will ask if something has accomplished or failed to accomplish some goal. So this would be something like, has the EU's, or has Greece's economics reforms done anything for their economy? The answer is an unequivocal no. But basically, you're asking whether or not they've accomplished or failed to accomplish some goal. Has something happened in the past? In other words, all you're doing is analyzing what has already happened. You're interpreting what has already occurred. You are analyzing what has already occurred, which is one of the main reasons I think that this is the easiest type of question, because all you have to do is look at the facts. All you have to do is look at history to be able to make your determination. Descriptive questions are based on facts. Now, all of these questions should be based on facts, but the only thing that a descriptive question is based on is the facts. It's not based on your interpretation, your prediction, your opinion. It is based on what has happened. What you're going to have to do when you have a descriptive question is you're going to have a list of, not a list of criteria, but a couple criteria where you can say, look, here's what we would see if this had happened. We can see these things, therefore it follows that this thing has happened. So this is a really simple approach, and answering this question is going to be pretty simple. We'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, the sixth type of question is a question of degree. Now, questions of degree are, I think, some of the most tricky to identify. Oftentimes, they can be hard to determine whether or not something is a question of degree. Questions of degree determine how much something is. How much is X, or how significantly will X affect Y? So it doesn't ask you to say, is something happening, or is something going to have an effect? All it's asking is, how great will that effect be? How significant will that effect be? How much is it going to affect a certain situation? These questions are often disguised as other types of questions, so be really careful. These were always the hardest for me to identify. The first couple of years I kind of struggled to identify them. The last 2 years, as subconscious, I practiced it so much that I started to see them. So now it's obvious, it might be obvious to you. But questions of degree can oftentimes be disguised as other types, yes?
When you're practicing prepping for Extemp at your house, where do you find Extemp questions?
If you go to Extemp Central? If you just Google search Extemp Central, they publish 10 international and 10 US questions every week.
Oh, okay.
So there's 20 at your disposal every week, and there's an archive of like their last several
And it's
weeks.
called Extemp what?
Extemp Central.
Central.
I think the website, like the URL is SpeechGeek. Don't quote me on that. All of my examples I got from there. So if you go through those, it might look familiar to you.
Cool.
But basically, that's a great place you can go to practice, but good question. Okay. Questions of degree force you to impact. Now, all of my debaters in the room know what an impact is, right? Yay. No, there you go. Okay, but yeah, you have to impact things. You have to say how severe is something going to be? What effect is something going to have on something else? How significantly will China's economic downturn affect the US economy? That would be a form of a degree question. How substantially is something going to happen? Last question, and I forgot questions of at the beginning. The last question deals with timing. Questions of timing ask whether or not now is the right time to do something. In other words, they'll follow the form, is now the time to do X? This is actually a phrasing that I see a lot. I didn't think it was any different than other questions, maybe a policy question, but it actually does have a slight difference, and I'll talk about that. But an example of a question like this would be, is now the time to reverse minimum wage momentum or something like that? I don't know. But basically just saying something is happening right now, is now the time to stop that from happening. Or something hasn't happened, we haven't done something in the past, is now the right time to do it. These questions assume that we wanted to do X before, but we couldn't. So if you wanted to reform the minimum wage, is it time to reform the minimum wage? There's an assumption there that you wanted to reform the minimum wage to begin with, but you couldn't. You physically could not. There was something that kept you from doing it. Let's say that could be like legislative entrenchment. It wouldn't pass through Congress, but now it would pass through Congress, so now is the time to reform the minimum wage. You have to prove that something has fundamentally changed that allows you a unique opportunity in the current status quo that is different from a past status quo. There is an assumption that something existed that eliminated the possibility of X happening, that eliminated the possibility of that change happening. You have to prove that that no longer exists. You have to prove that now is different than then. It took me, I spent 5 minutes on that last 2 words, then. It like messed with my head so hard. I think I got it right. Basically all I'm trying to say is you have to prove that now is fundamentally changed from the way things were before. That's what you have to do with timing questions. Anyone have questions? Okay, let's get to
We
examples.
just switched out of then with before.
Yeah, I know.
Wonderful.
But challenging. Okay, does anyone have questions on those before we get to some examples? Okay. Somebody raise their hand and read the first one. Okay, go ahead.
Should the Commission on Presidential Debates lower the threshold of support that third-party candidates need to acquire to participate?
All right, what type of question is this?
Domestic.
No, not category. That's the category. What type of question is it?
Oh, shit.
Action.
Which type of action?
Close-ended.
Exactly. You have an
What
X.
should X do?
You have an X agency, and you're proposing a specific change. So you're saying, should X take this specific action? Remember, close-ended action has both a specific actor and a specific action. Example 2.
How will Venezuela's economic difficulties affect Cuba?
Right.
Sort of sounds like the last one.
Establish predictive.
It's dealing with something that exists, Venezuela's economic difficulties, and it asks you to predict what effect that will have on something else. So it's something that exists and something that is going to have an effect on something else. Example 3.
Should minimum wages be determined by an by-state basis?
Okay.
Open-ended action.
Alright.
Close-ended action?
Yes. State-by-state basis is specific. An open-ended action question phrase like this would, how should the minimum wage be reformed? how should the minimum wage change? What should the United States do about the minimum wage crisis? It asks you for a specific opinion that you have to, not judging something specific. So this, again, is a closed-ended action. 4. I'll read this one. Would a Donald Trump presidency significantly alter American foreign policy towards Russia?
Unestablished predictive.
Close?
Established predictive.
No.
No, because establish would be what will the effects be.
What's that word right there?
Should.
Oh,
Question of degree.
Significantly?
Yes.
Significantly, so it's question of degree.
There is an assumption that Donald Trump's election is going to affect Russia. The question is not whether or not Donald Trump will affect Russia, but how significant that impact will be. Also, a lot of people assume that it's going to be a negative impact, so how bad will that question be? Again, it's a slight difference from a degree to an unestablished predictive. If it weren't for this word significantly, it would be an unestablished predictive because it's a hypothetical. But because it's asking you how bad something is or how significant something is, it takes the form of degree. Okay, example 5. Somebody.
Oh, it's that one again.
Matthew.
The exact same thing.
How can the West ensure that Erdogan does not destroy Turkish democracy?
Okay, what type of question is
That's
that?
open-ended action.
Open-ended action.
Yes, because it's asking how can X agency accomplish Y goal? What can somebody do about something? All right, last example for this. Yes.
Will the U.S. economy experience a recession by the end of 2016?
Okay, what type is this?
It's predictive, isn't it?
Establishment.
well, we started
Okay.
out there, kind of.
What will the effects?
This
so it's not-
is. This is where it gets a little tricky. Okay.
It's descriptive.
I'm going to explain why it is descriptive. It is neither established or unestablished. We do not currently have an economic recession, right? It is not asking what will happen if an economic recession occurs. So it's not presenting a hypothetical, nor is it making some judgment about something current, nor is it making the effect, what effect will something that is already established, what effect will that have? It is neither an established predictive or an unestablished predictive. Here's why it's a descriptive. There are a certain number of criteria that are used for economic recession. Questions like this will pop up a lot, and this is why I'm explaining it specifically. Questions about whether or not an economic recession or an economic boom will happen. There are certain markers in a society or in an economy that will lead an economy towards a recession or lead an economy towards a potential boost in growth. What that means is to answer this question, you have to do so descriptively. You have to look at the past. You have to look at what is now in order to determine, in a sense, what is going to happen. But you're not making a claim about what is going to happen, you're making a claim about what is going on right now. You're making a claim about what is happening now. That's all you're doing. So you're describing something, you're describing a certain amount of criteria that might lead to a solution. You're not trying to predict some kind of judgment about that thing. Predictive questions will predict some judgment about something, but they usually will not predict if something just generally will exist. Usually that is going to be covered by a more descriptive basis. That probably doesn't make too much sense. I just put that in there to show you guys that this isn't always cut and dry. It seems simple, but you are going to get those outliers, those specific types of questions that you're going to have to identify, in your opinion, what those are. You might disagree with me that this is a predictive. I always just interpreted these types of questions as descriptive. That's what I did, that's what worked for me. If you think it fits better as a predictive, then you can go ahead and do that. But this, in my opinion, is a descriptive because you're dealing with what is now, not necessarily focusing on what is going to happen. Even though that might seem like what the question is asking, that's not ultimately what your answer is going to take the form of. I don't know if that makes sense, but again, it's not cut and dry, it's not going to always be super easy and super simple. It wouldn't be fun, it wouldn't be challenging if it was always super easy and super simple. So, yeah. Okay.